Hi, folks. My name is Lance Hurst, and you can refer to me with they, them, or he, him pronouns. And so today, what I want to do is I want to share with you a topic that many of us have grown up in the church hearing about multiple times, and that is about sexuality and how it intersects with our faith. So if you're like me and you grew up in more conservative church spaces, you probably heard a lot about sex um, in ways that we may not think of as helpful anymore, or maybe we just have genuine questions. So, what I want to offer today is just a way to think about how faith and sexuality might intersect. So, pray with me and we'll get started. Spirit of God, we give thanks for this time and this space. We give thanks for the gift of our humanity and the ways that our bodies are amazing and they do connect, and that even in something like sex, we can learn and know you more. So help us to see you more clearly in this moment. Amen. So, first, what I want to do is I want to invite us to a centering practice here. So, one of the things that we know is true about our brains is oftentimes they're going all over the place, and we really just need a moment to come back to a center, come back to a grounding. So, what I invite you to do right now is just to find a way to pause. If you can, I invite you to just sit still and notice what's going on for you right now. If you can put your hands on your lap, you can fold them or put them on your lap, put your feet on the ground, or sit crisscross applesauce, whatever works for you in this moment. And what we're going to do right now is we're just going to breathe. We'll take a few clarifying breaths together. So when you're situated in a posture that's relaxed but also alert, I invite you to close your eyes or find a fixed gaze. And what we'll do in this moment is start with a deep inhale and a slow exhale. Now again, a deep inhale and a slow exhale. And one more time, a deep inhale and a slow exhale. And just notice how you feel coming into this space. So one of the things that I just want to highlight for us as we move forward is something that we believe as a ministry practice is we believe in gathering together. So even in this virtual digital space where we're not necessarily talking to each other right now, there is some kind of gathering that's happening. So I want to highlight two reasons why we do this. So one is for community and connection, right? We're actually trying to build something together here. We're trying to connect in some way. So that includes connecting with our own selves, because oftentimes we're so busy that we're not connecting to ourselves. That includes connecting to others that we care about, others that we don't know. Maybe even in this digital space, it looks like typing something in the comments, sharing what's going on with you, and then reacting to others. And the other piece is our creator. So recognizing that there's something more than us, something larger than us that's holding us in this time and place. Now, aside from community and connection, we also gather because we want to engage, we want to grow, we want to be able to question, to explore and reimagine our faith. So I certainly grew up in a world where questions weren't necessarily welcomed. And when I did ask questions, I would get really easy answers that felt nice in the moment, but didn't really help me in the long run. And so we want to create a space where we can actually ask questions and say, you know what, maybe we don't have the answer. Maybe we have to wait. Maybe we have to search for it. We need to sit with things. We need to be open to things like doubt, questions, and a lack of clarity or certainty, and make the best with what we have and recognize that God is present to us through all of it. So, one of the things that we've been talking about is what is faith and why does it matter? So, a few weeks ago, we left off with this quote, and I just want to share it again because this is really the framework that we are using for thinking about faith and what it is. So, Richard Rohr, he's one of my favorite writers about spirituality. He says this: our faith is not a belief that dogmas or moral opinions are true, but a faith that ultimate reality slash God slash Jesus is accessible to us and even on our side. Jesus was able to touch and heal people who trusted him as an emissary of God's love, not people who assessed intellectual statements and decided whether they were true or false. Let me just capture that moment again. That Jesus's healing, his love, was not in response to people who said, this statement is true or false. It wasn't a cognitive, intellectual belief, but it was a trust that God was at work in the world. And that's really what we're after here. This is why we believe faith matters, because faith impacts the way that we live. Certainly, it impacts what we believe on an intellectual level as well. But we are framing faith as much less about specific beliefs that you have to believe XYZ to be accepted or belong, but more about how we practice life together. How do we find each other? So today what we're really focusing is on faith, sex, and love. So one of the questions that I think is helpful for us to always think through is what do we think about sex and spirituality? Or what do we feel when we think about those things? I think it's important just to notice what's going on in our body when we hear those words. Sex and faith. Do you often hear those things together? Does it feel good to hear those together? Does it feel awkward or strange? What about sex and spirituality? Does saying spirituality instead of faith somehow make you feel differently about it? Does it feel more comfortable, less comfortable? Just take a moment and notice there what's going on. So, one of the people that we're really going to rely on to help us think through this, his name is David M. Carr. So, he is a biblical scholar. He especially writes about the Hebrew Bible, what many of us grew up calling the Old Testament. And he says this in his book, The Erotic Word. From the outset, Christianity has depicted sex as a dangerous, chaotic, anti spiritual force. So it's really no surprise that we would wrestle with what faith and sex have to do with each other, or spirituality and sexuality have to do with each other, because Christianity has a long history of struggling with what to do with sex. What do we do with our bodies? What do we do with sexual urges? And oftentimes, I think the key phrase for me that really sticks out here is anti spiritual force. That it has been depicted so often as something that's antithetical to our spirituality. So we've often equated celibacy with spirituality as a result, right? That people who refrain from sexual activity are the more spiritual ones. And in our present time, David M. Carr would talk about how we often use sex as a commodity, meaning sex is something that we use for selling things. We think about sex as, well, if I do this, maybe I'll get this back. It becomes an exchange of goods. And in the past, especially, we still do this to some extent, of course. But when we think about the Hebrew Bible, especially, we can see how sex was used as a means of gaining power. So, one of my favorite stories to think about this is at the end of King David's life, when we're reading the first two chapters of First Kings, King David is dying. And On his deathbed, one of the things that they do to see if he's even able to reign anymore is they bring a young maiden to him. And the idea is if he can find that sexual energy within him, if he has that power, so to speak, then he's clearly going to be okay and he's going to be able to be king. But what we find is David is weak and dying, and he doesn't have interest in that. So they kind of push David aside and say, okay, King David, it's time for you to go on. And they're looking at who's going to be the king next, right? So sex is really viewed as part of the power that lies within him. So when we think about this concept then of sex and power, sex and commodity, one of the words that we often use in our culture is erotic. We certainly connect the idea of things that are erotic with sexuality. So how do you understand that concept of erotic? What comes up for you? So again, going back to David Carr, he writes this. He says, "We are alienated from our erotic selves. As a result, our sexuality and spirituality are sharply separated. Both are harmed." So it's interesting that for David Carr, he sees that sexuality and spirituality are intrinsically connected because they're just parts of who we are as human beings. And so when we alienate ourselves from that part, where we can't just alienate ourselves from one or the other. It will inevitably affect both. So this goes back to the idea of having a centering practice, right? A grounding practice. We live our lives so disconnected, so separate from ourselves. Yet the invitation here is to reconnect with the self, to engage with what's going on within us and notice what comes up. And because we've been so alienated from ourselves, I know I find sometimes I'm afraid of what I feel. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable to actually feel what I'm feeling in my body. So the erotic in David Carr, in the way that he's seeing it, is our core desires that include sexuality, but also more. So instead of thinking erotic just as something sexual, he thinks about erotic as this energy that lives within us. And with that energy, it wants to be pushed out into many things. So part of that may be sexual energy, but it also includes the very energy that gives us life, that pushes us into the things that we feel passionate about. That, in a sense, is also erotic energy. Audre Lorde is a wonderful, amazing writer and activist, and she explains the erotic this way. She says it's those physical, emotional, and psychic expressions of what is deepest and strongest and richest within each of us being shared, the passions of love and its deepest meanings. So again, it's not just about sexuality, but it's about seeing if we drill below, right? So if we see sexuality and spirituality as sort of the surface of the iceberg, Audre Lorde and David Carr are saying, let's go below, let's go deeper into that iceberg and see what is at the bottom of it. And they're both essentially saying that what we find is this energy that underlies both of them, that it is this erotic energy that is springing up, that is giving life to us. And when we cut ourselves off from that energy because perhaps we've been taught to be afraid of sexuality, then we're cutting ourselves off from our spirituality too in some way. So let's reconnect them. Let's talk about how they can even be connected. So Carr writes, both sexuality and spirituality require space in one's life to grow. Neither flourish amidst constant busyness and exhaustion. Both require an openness to being deeply affected by someone outside of oneself, whether one's lover or God. Both involve the whole self. Finally, at their most intense, both spirituality and sexuality involve an interplay between closeness and distance. Neither sexuality nor spirituality work if one is seeking a constant high. It's really interesting to think about how there are similarities between sexuality and spirituality here. And I think that David Carr does a good job of helping us think through the way that they actually are more connected than we think about. So, sex and faith are not really two separate things, but they're both parts of our humanity. That we are longing, right? As spiritual beings, we're longing for something connected, something that's much larger than us. But again, that requires us to actually slow down, to take note of what's happening in our bodies. And David Carr would say that good sexuality, helpful and healthy sexuality, also requires us to slow down and connect with what's going on in our bodies. So let's look at Jesus and love then. Perhaps this tangible Jesus as a sign of God's love can be a model of God's tangible presence in others we love. So much of the tradition emphasizes how God becomes flesh in Jesus. If we focus too exclusively on God's revelation through this earthly man, we may miss ways in which he might be a paradigm of how God is equally present in others whom we love and in the world in general. So here's what I love about this quote, and Richard Rohr writes about this as well. We often get so fixated within Christian tradition, and you've probably experienced this if you go to church with Jesus. It can become all about Jesus. And in some ways, it's really helpful, and in other ways, it's not. So, David Carr is highlighting one of the ways that it can be not helpful for us and how it impacts the way that we think about sexuality. So, really, what we can glean, what we can gain from Jesus is this recognition of God being enfleshed, that God valuing the human experience, that God embraces the human experience, including sexuality. God is not afraid of our humanity. And so, what we see here then is if we can recognize this truth in Jesus, of God enfleshed in Jesus, can we recognize that truth elsewhere? Can we see God enfleshed within ourselves? Can you recognize God enfleshed in the people that you love? And I wonder if we can see this, how does that shift how we think about faith and sex then? What if that helps us to think about loving others, even through our sexuality, as more whole and holy, as about connecting with the sacred, connecting with the divine? So at the end of the day, I'll leave you with this quote. It's from 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. It's simply, God is love. God is love, friends. And love includes sexuality. Sometimes sex is not about love. Sometimes sex is even harm. Yet, when we can allow our sexuality and our spirituality to remarry each other, to reconnect with each other, I think that what we find is this God who is love, this God who invites us into love, a love that is filled not just with warm, fuzzy feelings, but a love that actually moves the way that we act towards ourselves and each other. And that we can reconnect to that energy that's within us, that erotic energy, and let that energy fuel not just our sexuality in helpful and healthy ways, but also fuel our work, fuel our rest, fuel our play, that we would find a greater connection within ourselves and with the world around us. Friends, pray with me. Spirit, we give thanks for the ways that you have created us. We are spiritual beings and sexual beings. So help us to find a balance. Help us to find the truth here, the reality, and help us to get in touch with that erotic energy that lies within each of us. May that energy fuel us to love with abandon. Amen. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.